TUTAMÉIA está ao vivo, transmitindo diretamente aqui dos nossos estúdios domésticos, com a Eleonora.
O Rodolfo.
E do outro lado da tela, conversa conosco hoje o analista internacional, jornalista historiador, Vijay Prashad, que a Eleonora agora apresenta o nosso convidado aqui com mais detalhes e inicia essa conversa que aqui no São Paulo é no início da tarde. Eleonora.
Vijay, it's an honor to have you here in TUTAMÉIA. I will introduce you in Portuguese and then we begin talking in English. Vijay Prashad é diretor do Instituto Tricontinental de Pesquisa Social, é historiador, membro do Partido Comunista da Índia, marxista, editor-chefe da Left World Books da Índia, e um analista, como o Rodolfo disse, autor de vários livros. Eu vou mostrar aqui dois que a gente tem aqui na nossa biblioteca, sobre a qual a gente já falou aqui, Balas de Washington, já falamos aqui no TUTAMÉIA com o Vijay sobre isso, e Estrela Vermelha sobre o Terceiro Mundo, ambos pela expressão popular. Vijay, thank you again. We're going to begin talking about Palestine. We saw this week the cyber-terrorism attacks of Israel in Lebanon. Today, you were seeing Israel bombing Beirut. Gaza, we saw more than 40,000 people dead by Israel. What can you see? What can you analyze the situation in the Middle East?
Well, the first thing is that, Israel has been conducting its bombing of Gaza since October. It hasn't really been able to produce any kind of breakthrough. It's very clear that despite the fact that Israel has been bombing Gaza, it's very clear that there hasn't been any kind of decisive military, completion of that war. I mean, I don't even know what the end game is. Israel hasn't been able to demolish the Hamas Islamic Jihad fighters. It hasn't been able to put an end to the resistance coming from Gaza. So its end game in Gaza is unclear. Mr. Netanyahu is unwilling to stop the bombing there. In fact, he has gone further afield, and as you saw, they assassinated the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran, a great act of destabilizing adventure to go out there to Iran, to attack Iranian soil, understanding full well that the Iranians take hospitality seriously, and to kill somebody who's a guest of Iran inside Iran is a real insult to the Iranians, and they've been thinking about how to retaliate. Meanwhile, of course, when this war began not war, to have a war, you need two armies. There is no war. There is just a bombardment. Hezbollah attacked Israel from the north of Israel's borders, trying to relieve some pressure on Gaza. Israel has been in various ways trying to confront Hezbollah. There have been previous bombing raids in Beirut. They went and assassinated people in Beirut over the course of these 7 months. But in recent days, it has become very clear that Mr. Netanyahu, knowing full well that world opinion is really turning against Israel, is trying to escalate some kind of war against the Lebanese. But I must say that there has been an error here, because he has miscalculated. In this very illegal attack upon the Lebanese people through the use of these pagers, smartphones, tablets, heaters, all kinds of electronic devices, what the government of Mr. Netanyahu has done has to actually bring together the Lebanese people. In fact, the Lebanese foreign minister made it very clear that Hezbollah will retaliate at some point. This is a very unique situation, because typically inside the ruling coalitions in Lebanon, there is a uncertainty about the role of Hezbollah. Even though Hezbollah is a political party in good standing in the parliament, it's also a military organization. Well, now, both the Hezbollah leadership, Hassan Nasrallah giving a speech, which I thought was a very balanced speech again. And the Lebanese government have made it clear that they are very upset by what has happened, and a terrorist attack on the citizens of Lebanon, they would like to retaliate. I mean, all of this comes at a point when Iran is looking to retaliate, Lebanon is looking to retaliate, Israel continues its genocidal bombing. It is a really dangerous situation. I mean, having lived for 2 years previously in Beirut, I can tell you that the city is generally on eggshells, wondering when the next war is coming. In fact, a sociologist wrote a book about that, about Beirut's general sense of consciousness is when is the next war coming? And it may come at any point. I mean, there could be, from this one bombing, those drones, this, that, and the other, Hezbollah might launch its missiles at Israel, and it has many. At which point, it begs the question, what will the United States do? I must say, as the US is going towards the final weeks before a presidential election, I doubt very much that either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump want to see a full-scale war break out between Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Israel. I think this is not something they would like to see, but it looks like that could happen.
So, Vijay, some analysts say that these cyber terrorist attacks and the bombing of Beirut, they are a new stage of the war, in the sense that Israel might be believing that Hamas is done. Do you believe that? Do you agree with that? Does that make any sense?
I mean, it's impossible to judge that sort of claim. Hamas is done. What does that even mean? I mean, the question we should first understand is Hamas is not the issue here. Hamas is not the key issue. The key issue is that since 1948, the Palestinians have found different platforms to articulate their longing for national liberation. In the early period, it was civic organizations set up in Kuwait and other parts of the Palestinian diaspora. Those civic organizations coalesced to become Fatah and eventually the Palestinian Liberation Organization. These groups have a history that goes back decades. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was set up in 1964. It actually precedes Hamas by 23 years, which is a generation. Hamas is formed only in 1987, and then Islamic Jihad follows that. So the question isn't Hamas. The question is, have the Israelis been able to defeat the Palestinian national liberation ambition? And the answer is no. Hamas is merely an instrument, one instrument of many of that ambition. Now, the second question is, has Israel been able to defeat Hamas militarily? There's something absurd about that question, because Hamas is not an organization with a military capable of taking on the Israelis in frontal warfare. They don't have planes, they don't have ships, they don't have guided missiles. I mean, that's not the nature of their conflict. They have the ability to conduct guerrilla warfare, which they do very well. I mean, they are able to do the guerrilla warfare with rockets, with guns, with all kinds of things. So they are very much aware of what they are capable of. And in this particular conflict, Hamas has been able to keep going. I mean, the fact is, from January onwards, Hamas prevented the entry of the Israeli army into Gaza. The Israelis had thought phase 1 of the war, aerial bombardment, phase 2, they enter into Gaza. They basically go street by street, clear out, the various resistance fighters, not only Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation, go street by street, clear them out. But after the Israelis entered into northern Gaza, they took fire from the resistance forces. They began to lose their soldiers. So they pulled out of Gaza. In other words, even on this second proposition that Hamas's military arm has been decimated, In fact, the Palestinian liberation fighters have prevented the Israeli military from remaining in Gaza. The Israeli military comes in, holds the section, often goes out. They are holding some parts of Gaza, no doubt, but they don't have a permanent presence everywhere. They are taking fire, which is why the Israelis restarted the bombing in the north when they felt they hadn't fully decimated Hamas. So I don't think this has got to do with the destruction of Hamas. They are now turning to Lebanon. I think what's happening is Mr. Netanyahu is being frustrated because he feels that there's insufficient legitimacy for their bombardment of Gaza, and he's seeking the legitimacy elsewhere. Mr. Netanyahu wants to make this a conflict between Iran and Israel. The Iranians are not interested. Syed Hassan Nasrallah, a very wise man, is not interested. But they are going to continue to try to draw Hezbollah more directly into the conflict, to draw the Iranians in and so on, and move this from a war against the Palestinians, a genocide against the Palestinians, to a war against Iran, for which they feel they'll get more legitimacy. But my feeling is the Iranians are not going to fall into an Israeli trap easily, and they will not allow this to become a conflict between Iran and Israel. This is a genocide being conducted against the Palestinians, and that's how Hezbollah sees it. Nasrallah said so just a few days ago, and that's exactly, I think, how the Iranians see it.
On the other hand, we're going to see next week, for the first time in the United Nations, the speech of a representative of the Palestine. It's the first time since the United Nations exist. What's the meaning of this speech, and what can you tell us about the divisions among the Palestine, Hamas, and the others, many organizations? Do you believe that this genocide that is ongoing genocide will certainly unify these tendencies?
Yeah, just 3 points here, I think, that are important to think about. Number one, earlier this year, the United Nations accepted the state of Palestine as a formal entity in the UN structure. The state of Palestine used to be an observer, but earlier on, this was changed. Then, just recently, the state of Palestine put forward a resolution condemning the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians, particularly the occupied Palestinian territory, the OPT. And what the resolution did was it picked up from a very strong verdict by the International Court of Justice on the occupation and said this unlawful occupation must end. 142 countries voted this week on that resolution and said they agreed with the state of Palestine. Handful, 14 countries voted against it, led by Israel, the United States, and so on. That's a really important point. I think we should consider the state of Palestine has put itself on the map with this resolution, a really key resolution. And then when the Palestinian ambassador to the UN speaks at the UN, he's going to speak with the legitimacy of this resolution. That's one point. The second point is that it's true that since the Oslo Accords were signed between Yasser Arafat, the United States, and Israel in 1994, since that time, there's been a great divide in Palestinian politics because several sections of the Palestinian movement opposed the Oslo, what Edward Said called the Oslo Versailles, or the surrender at Oslo. Several factions opposed that, and this opened the disagreements, whether it was between the Oslo people, Fatah, large sections of the PLO, and so on, and then the other side, which was, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and so on. That was the principal divide among the Palestinian political world, not, whether the politics was religious or anything. It was your attitude to Oslo. That was the divide. In 2004, Palestinian political prisoners released a letter. It's called Document from the Prisoners. Don't worry about it. She'll calm down in a minute. She doesn't like hearing about the genocide. I can tell you that. because, every time I'm talking about it, she barks. This might have to do with the fact that there's a lot of conversations about the genocide these days, but still. So in 2004, there was this prisoner's letter where the leaders of all the major factions who were held by Israel as political prisoners miraculously created a document which they released from prison asking for unity. That was in 2004. Didn't happen. Very difficult to produce unity. Last year, before this thing began, actually in October, the Chinese government invited 14 Palestinian organizations, including small groups that are in Syria and so on, and basically told them, look, we need you to come to Beijing. You need to start a conversation. You need to, bury the hatchet. After October 7th, this conversation among the 14 Palestinian factions deepened. And this year, they released a letter, a public statement in Beijing, saying that they have now found some agreement in action. So that's the second point, that there is, in fact, agreement in action. They want to close the gaps created by Oslo. In one sense, the Oslo problem has been overcome by this condition now. That's the second, I think, point to put on the table. The third point to put on the table is that Palestinian politics has been extremely hemorrhaged by the number of people who are political prisoners. For instance, one of the tallest trees in the Palestinian political world is Khalida Jarrar. Khalida Jarrar is a leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, left-wing group. She has been in and out of prison, mostly in prison, since 2015. And recently she released a letter where she said that, look, they've cut off oxygen to my room, to my cell, and I'm sitting next to a small pipe and trying my best to breathe from it. I mean, the Israelis are conducting what an Israeli scholar called politicide, killing off the politics of the Palestinians. And once you say, look, there are no Palestinian politicians, then you can say we have nobody to negotiate with. Then you can say, let's get the bulldozers going and just push the Palestinians out. So this third point is very important. There are a large number of Palestinian political prisoners, and I very much hope that governments of Brazil and so on take up the issue of politicide in Palestine. I mean, I would hope that President Lula, for instance, would ask the Israeli government officially if he can visit the Israeli prisons, meet the political prisoners, talk to Khalida Jarrar. After all, he was a political prisoner himself. And it may be a good idea for President Lula to take the initiative to go and visit the Palestinian political prisoners, to give them strength and to raise the issue of the need for a Palestinian politics out of this dilemma.
Also, recently, I think 10 or 15 days ago, it was released a new report about torture of the Palestinian prisoners. So, I mean, it seems clear that the position of Israel posing as a democracy is being eroded. Or what do you think about it?
I mean, look, every country wants to be seen in the best possible light. And every country has some form of public diplomacy, where they go out there and say, this is the great thing, it's to attract tourism or whatever it is. This has become a normal feature of life, right? And when you do public diplomacy, you paper over all your problems. Israel has, I think, strangely been able to manufacture this idea around the world that it's a democracy. How can you be a democracy when you are occupying large parts of your neighboring area? The occupation I'm talking about, not even talking about 1948, is the occupations of 1967. The United Nations calls Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem the occupied Palestinian territory. You can't be a democracy while you are conducting an occupation. It's just not possible to think that. For instance, tomorrow, if Morocco decides no longer to be a monarchy and to become a republic, but Morocco continues to occupy Western Sahara. Would we call Morocco a democracy? I don't think so. You'd say, look, it's a democracy for this part. For those people, they are under occupation. They are your prisoners. How is it a democracy? So Israel has succeeded very well in public diplomacy, what they call hasbara, propaganda. They've succeeded very well in this. And I think that's unfortunate that people are taken in, or they so treat the occupation as normal that they don't see it as something that you need to integrate with your vision of Israel. You can have Israel as a democracy here and then the occupation over there. I'm afraid that's not logical. You have to put the two things together. And if you put Israel plus occupation together, it's not a democracy.
And what about the public opinion? We've seen in past months some of the largest demonstrations, both in the USA and Europe, of people in support of Palestine. I mean, the largest demonstration since Vietnam, maybe. So does this change anything? What's the meaning of this? What's the impact of these movements in the traditional politics or even in diplomacy?
Yeah, I mean, look, first let's be pretty honest with each other. There are huge demonstrations. This is important. Public opinion polls show that people are with the Palestinians. Why? What has changed? What changed? What was different in September of 2023? What's different is the nature of the Israeli bombardment. I mean, the nature of this bombardment is ruthless. They are bombing neighborhood upon neighborhood, killing children, killing babies. The Gaza's Ministry of Health released a report of the dead, and there are 400 pages of details, and the first few pages are under the age of 0. Just names after names of babies, infants. 10 pages of under 0. I mean, it's just horrendous. Young people seeing images of universities being bombed, hospitals being bombed, and so on. Heartsick. Look, frankly, nobody bombs like this. Okay, if the Russians had been bombing Ukraine like this, I can tell you, all over the world, those images would be everywhere. On CNN, on Fox News, on Globo, everywhere in the world, we would get wall-to-wall coverage of the atrocities of the Russian bombing. The Russians are not bombing at all like the Israelis are bombing in Gaza. It's not even the same kind. To call the two of them wars is, I think, an insult to the imagination. There's a war happening in Ukraine, that's true. But this is a massacre taking place in Gaza. It's a massacre. It is ghastly. That's what has propelled millions of people to say, you know what, I'm going to take to the streets. I'm going to meet my public officials. I'm going to yell and scream outside. I can't tolerate this because this is not a war. This is a massacre and it's grotesque. I think that's the very important point people need to digest, that this is not just a war. This is something horrible that's taking place. And I think related to this is a loss of faith in political institutions. I mean, let's take the case of Brazil as well. Even last year, Mr. Lula was talking about the role that countries like Brazil and so on could play in trying to, bring down the temperature in the world, bring peace to the world. And I'm afraid I haven't seen that. I haven't even seen more measured political leaders, President Lula as one of them, doing enough, saying enough. Why haven't Xi Jinping, Lula, I don't know, Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, Gustavo Petro of Colombia, why haven't they said, look, we're going to get into a plane and we're going to fly to Egypt and we're going to cross the border into Gaza because this is intolerable? Why haven't they done that? I mean, look, frankly, if I was a head of state of a government, and that's really hard to imagine, this man who hasn't shaved in a couple of days becoming the head of anything is hard to imagine. Maybe the leader of his dogs is all I can see. But if I were the head of state of any government, I would use as much as I could of my influence to go there, make a stand, cross the line, bring the press with me, just, send my peacekeepers, like constitute a group of Brazilian peacekeepers to enter in the southern part of Gaza and just enter into the city and say, we refuse to let you continue bombing. Where is that? Where are we? Why haven't the Arab armies come up to Rafah and said, we are entering as a peacekeeping force? If you bomb Gaza, you bomb us. If you bomb us, we're going to war with you. Why haven't people done that? I just don't get it. The young people who are on the streets are demanding everything, and our leaders are just not doing enough. That's basically, I'm just laying my frustrations out to the two of you as if I'm sitting in your living room and chatting with you. But I mean, these are real frustrations that I think are motivating young people to take to the streets.
Yes, of course. And so we are always talking about journalists. We have more than 100 journalists assassinated in Gaza. And many organizations are trying to make an effort to enter Gaza, journalists to enter Gaza, but it didn't happen.
So far, it hasn't happened.
No, yeah, go ahead. It's just not easy, I was going to say. They don't want journalists there.
Yeah,
they're clean journalists, in fact, as you said. So, yeah. I mean, that's why journalists can't take the lead. That is why I feel like, I hope, I wish, I'm praying that world leaders would do something physical, material, rather than just make statements.
And let's talk. You mentioned Ukraine. What's your vision on the status of the Ukraine war? And we saw many movements recently. What can you tell us about your vision on Ukraine?
It's interesting. We just released a newsletter on the question of the Ukraine war and the danger of all these countries talking about allowing the use of French, British, and US medium to long-range missiles against Russian soil. Everybody has escalated. Keir Starmer of the UK was in Washington, met with Biden. His foreign minister, David Lammy, is making comments saying that, look, we're close to a decision on whether to allow British medium-range missiles to be used by the Ukrainians to fire inside Russia and so on. It's a huge, dangerous escalation, frankly. And, the Russians could retaliate with their own medium-range missiles now fired not just into Ukraine, but into France or the UK. God forbid that there will be long-range missiles used against the United States and then the US retaliates and so on. It's all very dangerous. And so when I put this newsletter together, just as a refresher, went back and looked at the negotiations between the US and Russia in November and December of 2021, before the Russians entered Ukraine. It's very interesting. Right through, Mr. Putin talking to Biden directly, number of occasions, says quite straightforwardly, we would like security guarantees. We don't want Ukraine to join NATO. We don't want NATO missiles in Ukraine. All we are asking for is security guarantees. In fact, they put a treaty on the table. Partly, the Russians have been afraid that the US has unilaterally walked out of the arms control regime. So they put a treaty on the table. The United States just ignored all of that and then drove, in a way, the Russians into that conflict. Look, I'm not happy that there's a war happening in Ukraine. I'm sorry to say this to some people who think this is a great idea. I've been, like, you have covered wars. I've seen what wars do, the destruction, the trauma afflicted upon children, generation upon generation of trauma. Wars are ghastly. Nobody should ever want to promote war for any reason. Most people who are happy with wars have never been in a war zone. They haven't felt the sound warfare. I mean, the ways those bombs explode, your blood vessels in your body start to shred. the dust, toxic dust everywhere. I mean, it's horrible. Nobody wants it. The Russians were trying to avoid it. They entered into Ukraine. The moment they entered, a negotiation began in Belarus, in Turkey, between the Ukrainians and the Russians. All of this could have been cleared up, but it wasn't. And now we are stuck, and NATO wants to escalate this. I think this is terrible. I hope very much sane minds prevail. Anti-war movements build up. In Germany, there's already a political crisis. The ruling coalition led by Olaf Scholz has lost control of the narrative. In Eastern Germany, in Thuringia and Saxony, they were not able to prevail in the elections. In fact, the Alliance for Deutschland from the right did very well, but so did the Bundeswagenet, a new left-wing party which has said no to NATO. We don't want this war. We don't want missiles, US missiles in Germany and so on. That's German politics. In French politics, the emergence of the left in the parliamentary and European elections, the defeats inflicted on Macron suggests that the French public as well wants an end to this. So, forget my opinion on this war. The European people seem to want to back away from it. And I hope very much that there will be support for the European people coming from the global south. I mean, coming week, I'm going to be in New York for the UN General Assembly. The magazine Foreign Policy, of all unlikely venues, has invited me to have a debate with the former Kenyan ambassador to the UN, who is taking the position that Russia's entry into Ukraine is a form of colonialism. I'm going to be debating him on that. I think I'm going to be representing the vast majority of people in the global south who don't believe it's a form of colonialism. In fact, who want this war to end because it's affecting fuel and food prices, and so on. I'm very interested to see how this debate turns out, but I'm certainly, I feel that I'm not just speaking for myself on this, but in fact, I think the bulk of the global south is of the view this is a war driven by NATO. This is not Russia's war. It's not our war.
And this is a war of NATO targeting finally China. It's Russia now, but the main target is China.
I think the main target is that the West, particularly the United States, was seeing Europe slip into a kind of Eurasian connection. There was gas and oil supplied by the Russians, but there were large investments coming from China. The industrial base of Europe has shifted to China. You may remember that we used to talk about Germany's Ruhr Valley, the region of its industry. Well, Germany's Ruhr Valley is no more in the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley is in Harbin province in China, capital city Wuhan. That's where German industry has relocated. So in that sense, in my opinion, Europe was integrating finally after centuries of break from Asia. The natural integration of Eurasia, it's a natural process. It was held back by the fact that there was an Iron Curtain. Then it was held back by the lack of technology in earlier eras. Now, technology plus the lack of really any political disagreements enabled integration to take place. The US was worried the Atlantic axis would break, Europe would slip into this Eurasian world and imposed itself. This is a direct, we can go chapter and verse through the security documents of the US government where they basically say this stuff. You don't need to analyze it. They tell you this. This is what they feel. And they've now blocked it. And they are afraid of the rise of China and Russia and want to basically suspend the rise of these countries. You can't do it. The center of gravity of the world has gone to Asia. It's India, it's China, it's Indonesia. It's no more the UK, US, Europe, and so it's no more the Atlantic. The center of gravity is somewhere in the Indian Ocean. You got to come to terms with that. I think the creation of BRICS in 2009, Brazil, India, South Africa, China, Russia. Look, frankly, Russia, China, India, And well, just take these three, okay? Russia, China, India. These are Eurasian powers. You may be interested to know that Russia, which is, dealing with a real shift in its political economy, has moved a lot of its manufacturing into the eastern sector. In Siberia and other places, they're building cities there. They're connecting them to China and so on. They are moving their center of gravity away from Europe. Most Russian cities used to be, well, are still along the European, corridor. For instance, from St. Petersburg down to Moscow and then downwards all the way to the Georgian border. Most of the cities were there. But now the cities are going to move into the east. I mean, and that's something you can't stop. 3 of the 5 BRICS countries, in that sense, Eurasian countries. Brazil and South Africa, obviously not in Asia, but I think they also have a recognition of this. Brazil, for instance, its major trading partner is China. Future big trading partner will be India. That's the way it's going to go. Forget the days when Europe was a principal trading partner, or the United States, things like that. So this war in Ukraine and the pressure point in Taiwan are intended to prevent what I think is the actual movement of history. And they are only going to prevent the actual movement of history through war, which is really why we need to be very cautious, careful, and prevent this from happening. What I mean is prevent what from happening? The war against China, which I really hope never comes to be.
So just following this path, I'd like to that you could comment about the fact of the BRICS has been gaining or creating more muscle, and what is the impact of this in the geopolitics?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very cautious about the BRICS bloc because I would like people to understand its origins and see how far it can move from its origins. Let's go back to the origins for a minute. The BRICS emerged in 2009 as a formal entity, even though in 2003, India, Brazil, South Africa had created IBSA, basically to deal with pharmaceutical trade between these countries, how Brazil and South Africa could access cheap Indian pharmaceuticals. But the real BRICS process starts in 2009 as a consequence of the world financial crisis, when countries like Brazil, India, and so on realized, and particularly China, realized that, look, we can't keep selling to the United States. United States no longer the market of last resort. We have to find new markets. It was initially a real commercial or trade dilemma. They started to revive the old UN category, United Nations category, South-South cooperation. But it meant trade. I mean, you go back and look at the first BRICS summit. It was about trying to increase southern to southern complementarity in terms of trade, looking for new markets. The Chinese went one step further. Then they created One Belt, One Road, which became the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. Initially, this was a trade issue. It was a dilemma about the last buyer, who will be the last market for all the garbage that people are producing, plastic buckets, all that stuff. The United States was in a real sense, the garbage can of the world. It bought everything. So what happens when you come to the point where the US market is saturated, can't buy anything further? What happens next? Well, so that was BRICS. Eventually, as BRICS began to develop, a new consciousness emerged amongst these in these conversations. I think the key moment was 2011, when the United States and NATO went and bombed Libya without consideration for the African Union, without consideration for anything. They just went and bombed that country. In the final vote at the UN, Brazil and South Africa and other countries abstained. This created its own problem because later on reflection, they said we will never refrain to vote on an amendment, on a resolution like this, which results in the destruction of a country. We can't trust the West anymore. In fact, Vladimir Putin had made a statement in 2007 at the Munich summit when he said, no single master in the world. BRICS began to orient itself then as a more political instrument. to think about how to differently fashion world politics. South Africa, through BRICS, argued for an African permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. Brazil, through BRICS, argued for a permanent seat for Latin America. India, the world's largest country in terms of numbers, argued for itself to have a permanent seat in the Security Council. China and Russia already had a seat. In other words, all 5 early BRICS countries were asking for permanent seats in the Security Council. This moved BRICS from a trade economic body into a much wider body around politics. And I think that's where we are now. We are in a place where BRICS, using the G20, using those sorts of institutions, are trying to drive a kind of political, some sort of political agenda. Where this will go, I don't know. It's an unfinished project, my friends. But what we are definitely seeing from all the BRICS countries is an assertion that they want their national interests put on the table. This is true of Brazil, it's true of India, it's true of South Africa, true of the Chinese, true of the Russians, and true of the other 5 countries that have joined BRICS, including Saudi Arabia. They say, no longer are we willing to surrender our national interests to some global interest or wider interest or US interest. We want our national interests on the table. So that's where we are. Whether this will advance further, who knows? I think we have to be patient. People who jump ahead and say BRICS, is going to, I don't know if BRICS is going to solve all the problems in the world, but certainly you got to keep observing. People like us have to keep reporting what's happening, trying to keep our fingers right on the thread of history, feeling for the tremors. The thing about history or journalism is that we don't get a press release that tells you this is what is happening in humanity. There is no Office of Humanity that sends journalists press release. We have to put our fingers or one finger on the thread of history and feel every once in a while if there's a tremor. That's how I understand journalism. Every once in a while, we just touch and see, what does this mean? What does that mean? What does this attack in Lebanon mean? Feeling for the tremors, just to get a sense and then try to convey it to wider people. Why are we the ones who touch the thread of history? Because we are also people who've trained ourselves to read what the movements mean. We have a sense of history. We have a sense of sociology and so on. That's what makes journalists able to define, what's going on, to track trends and so on. It's not like we have an oracle or, as I said, a press release from the Department of Humanity. But if you ask me, I would say that this is the direction of BRICS. Where it goes, who knows?
Well, the next question is obvious. And how about the dollar and the military, U.S. military force? These 2 points, these 2 pillars of the American powers, they are changing, or it always remain a source of the United States power.
Well, I actually think that there are 3 areas of power that the United States and the global north are losing control over, haven't lost completely. One is control over raw materials. They don't control them like they used to. They can't tell countries, this is ours, our companies should extract and so on. They are being tested by other countries and people saying, look, we want to have sovereignty over our resources. They're also losing control over the arena of finance, including the dollar. De-dollarization may never happen in our lifetime because no other country in the world wants to submit their currency to the wiles of the global economy. The Chinese certainly don't want to give up capital controls and so on. Whether we'll be able to create a global currency or not, it's a big question. I don't know. But certainly, the United States losing control over the world financial systems. China and Russia largely conduct their trade between each other without dollars. They have substantially de-dollarized. So finance, they've lost control over the third area, which is science and technology. This is clear. I mean, there are as good phones made in South Korea, in obviously China, and so on. And we'll eventually end up seeing good technology made in Brazil. Hopefully, Brazil will start making aircrafts again. It was a sad day when you shut down Imban Air and so on. But in these three areas, the West doesn't control anymore. There are two areas where they do maintain control. One is, as you said, the military. Right now, 74% of global military spending is spent by the NATO countries. US government spends 1.53 trillion US dollars a year on the military. That is obscene. That's just an enormous amount of money. Of course, they control, military, they control destruction. They can bomb and destroy most countries in the world. Just a few countries can defend themselves. Most countries, there's no defense. If the US wants to fire a missile at your country, you can't defend against it. It's impossible. So they maintain that dangerous power. And that's why we call them dangerous. The other word we use is decadent. And this has to do with the other form of control or power that the US and its allies hold. And that's control over information. They control information. This is what makes them decadent. They are unwilling to allow rationality to come to the surface. I mean, let's take the case of the three of us. The three of us, different levels of experience as journalists. At least amongst us, we've had one senior editor. Congratulations to you. I never made it past the newsroom floor, but so be it. We are people with experience. We've covered things with sensitivity and so on. But none of us, and I'm speaking for all three of us, none of us will be taken seriously in any corporate newsroom, today. Like, imagine if one of us received an invitation to speak at, I don't know, CNN or something or the other. Not a chance. I mean, it's just not going to happen. Because they control the information. Even this foreign policy platform that I'm going to have, they invited me. It's a setup. I mean, I think the other guest from Kenya and the host will be arrayed against me. I'll be there talking about, how the Russians were put in a corner by NATO, and they're going to keep coming at me and saying, but Russia invaded. That's a dominant narrative. People in the room will clap when they say that. I have no chance. I'm being fed to the lions. I don't know why I'm even bothering to do it, but we take every opportunity, right? We take every opportunity. They control the information systems. We just don't. We right now are in a minority in terms of the power of getting our stories out there. I love coming on your program. Why? Because we can sit and chat, and we take time, and you give me time to go over ideas. You don't tell me, no, I don't agree with this, or you don't come in and say, to play devil's advocate, can I say this? You're interested in the unfolding of ideas. This is so rare in our time these days, where journalism has been corrupted by in form and in content. Not just in content, it's in form as well. The form of journalism doesn't allow for the unfolding of ideas, but it's about like trying to get you to say the wrong thing and so on. And I think in that way, the West continues to have military power and power over information.
Well, thank you for what you said about TUTAMÉIA, and but we'd like now to go to Latin America. What do you make of what's happening down here? I mean, Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico.
Well, I mean, in a way, isn't Mexico the shining example in all this? Because, in a way, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador and his fourth transformation has really, interested people. In fact, at Tricontinental, we are going to prepare a dossier to explain to people what is the fourth transformation. As you move out of Andres Manuel's presidency into Claudia Sheinbaum's presidency, I think it's something to learn from them. Generally, I think there's a real mess in Latin America, but it's not a mess merely at the political level. It's a mess at the social and cultural level. There is a way in which there's been a surrender to a kind of precarious economy, and a precarious economy creates toxic social forms. If you don't have regular jobs, good public transport, things like that, they're pulling their hair out trying to survive, and they have to commute long hours. They can't find regular jobs. There's no time to build a popular culture. They are prey to various forms of religiosity, whether it's evangelism or whatever it might be. There's no time to create a people's culture, working class culture, and so on. Mental health rates are up all over the world, but pretty spiky in Latin America. It's not just got to do with the use of drugs, it has to do with attempted suicide rates, a number that I think government should track very carefully. Lots of young people very upset by the way things are going in the world, despair, don't have faith in humanity, don't have faith in themselves, and so on. It's a very painful situation. I hope governments are closely monitoring the mental health crisis. Only 2% of healthcare budgets around the world go to mental health care. And that's on average, that's on average. Most mental health care is biologized, individualized, not seen as a social problem. And that's very important, because this lack of social life, the cultural apparatus to hold people in community and so on, all of this creates its political conundrums, and what you're seeing with the rise of the right across Latin America is actually not it can't just be a reflection of the politics, because that's a reflection of itself. It emerges out of a social crisis. You can't build a left project when society is so badly damaged. It's very difficult to do it when society is individualized and in despair. So even in Brazil, you have a president of the left, center left, he's running a center left government, but the society is broken. And, the forces of the right are right there smelling, sniffing for any problem. The Congress in Brazil is forever trying to shut things down. Then goes south to Argentina. That's in its own convulsion. Mr. Milei didn't come from nowhere. He is a result of the Argentinian malaise. I think Gustavo Petro is doing a pretty good job trying to hold things together, but he is also under pressure. The peace talks with the ELN have collapsed with a recent bombing at a police school. That's a threat from that side of the political spectrum. The other side of the political spectrum is pushing him to condemn the elections in Venezuela. I mean, the independent strength of the left, apart from the kind of Mexican left you have now, very hard to see. I don't see it in any country, really. An independent strength of the left that gives these people who won elections space to build their own politics. Lula, Petro, they're reacting to what's happening in society. They don't have enough space to articulate a political vision. Venezuela is a complicated story because there the right is very strong. I mean, I think this election result was by and large correct. Around 50% are with the government, with the Chavista movement, but about 45% is with the opposition. That's a polarized society. It's not a majority in any direction. It's a polarized society. And the right in Venezuela, which used to be the traditional right, COPE, Acción Democrática, and so on, the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, the right is now the far right of a special type. Maria Corina Machado, is like Vox in Spain, where her compatriot Leopoldo Lopez is sitting. This is like Bolsonarismo. This is not the traditional Brazilian right or the traditional Venezuelan right or even the traditional Colombian right. This is a vicious, nasty right wing, which is building on the toxicity on society. So what I would say is we have to focus a lot of attention on tracking what's happening in society, this sort of demise of community. You can't build socialism if you don't have a society.
That's perfectly true. But you talked about, just before you talked about the the media control that the right and the powers that the powers of the USA have, for example. But let's talk about the experience in Mexico, where maybe AMLO with his daily press conference in the morning, and also Claudia had a press conference, daily press conference at noon. Do they were able to I want to say break the wall, but make a hole in the wall? And are these experiences should be something that people, that governments, center governments and leftist governments in South America learn from?
I mean, I think there's something to be learned from what the Mexicans have done, what Morena has done. And that's why we are putting together this text, which we'll publish next year. We'll have to systematize it. We need to look carefully and so on. What I'm going to say to you now is merely my impressions, which are not scientific. I mean, I really haven't reported much from Mexico. I don't know Mexico as well as I would like to be honest with you. But I must say, I have watched a number of his press conferences. And I would say my immediate reaction is that one of the things that Morena did by putting Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador on television in front of reporters daily is they essentially said, let him talk directly to the people. If the media is going to muffle his voice, let him open his own social media account. Let him go out there and talk over the heads of the media. And that's what he's done. I mean, in a way, this is a kind of Protestantism, that you don't need the priest to talk to God. You can talk to God directly. And if God is the people and the priests are the media, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has conducted a Protestant reformation of the Mexican information order by talking directly to the people and not hoping that this or that newspaper would cover his press conference. And he made the press conference a really dramatic place. It was reminded me a lot, by the way, and I know this comparison is not fair, but it reminded me a lot of the pedagogical use of the microphone made by Fidel Castro. What Andres Manuel would do is he would put up a PowerPoint presentation and show sections from the Mexican Constitution, or put up a graph and discuss it and talk about the implications. I mean, it was like a seminar more than a press conference. He didn't stand there and field questions and was defensive. He actually tried to teach something and say, look, this is the problem in this, in Oaxaca, we have this issue, and in some, these are the things, and, you need to understand. I mean, it was hugely instructive. I remember watching Fidel for hours and hours and hours, being pedagogical in the same way. Chavez was similar. They would get out there and they would say, in Fidel was remarkable. He would give a lecture on the environment, where he would talk about environmental science and what are the different plants and so on. And this comes to publics that don't have access to full-scale education. And people began to appreciate that when you listen to Fidel, it's like having access to school. And I think what this AMLO was doing was similar. He was leading a kind of seminar every morning. I wouldn't even call it a press conference. It was a seminar, because his remarks before the questions are what I want to focus on, because it's in his remarks before the Q&A, when he opened it to reporters, that he did this sort of presentation, which was academic in nature, saying, let's look at these things from these points of view. He forced the press, in a way, to go back to college. And he didn't allow the press to just stand there and say, President, yesterday you were photographed at X. I mean, that was, if you listen to the questions, he lifted the level of discourse by lifting the level of his opening remarks. In the United States, when a president goes before the press, they always say, hello, nice to see you. Today I met with XYZ, and now we open for questions. I mean, it's not elucidating. They don't explain things. And this guy, to his credit, and I don't know how Claudia Sheinbaum will do with this, but, to his credit, he lifted the level of political discourse in Mexico. And I think that is a lesson that others can take.
Talking about the control, the information control, we see today a few great corporations controlling the media, Facebook, YouTube, very few corporations. A report made in 1980-81 by the United Nations, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in the top of it, showed that the root was to oligopolization of the media, and gave us a huge alert at that time. And since then, we only saw more monopolization. Do you believe that the Global South will be able to build another type of model of information or circulation of information to oppose to this media control we have today? That it's almost a CIA control of information.
I mean, I obviously everything you say I endorse, yeah, and I hope. But again, let's put our fingers on the string of history. It's not likely, not immediately. It requires an enormous net fixed investment to build media, as you well know. It's not true that you can, have a YouTube channel and break through the silence. Not true at all. Broadcast media continues to have power even on the internet. They build much greater audiences and things like that. It's also, as I said, not just content but form. We don't have production values like these people have with the huge net investment. We don't have the ability to generate entertainment which draws people in. We just don't have that. You and I, we don't have shows that talk about the weather and bring people in every morning. They tune in just to watch the weather and to watch some celebrities talk. We don't have the means to do that. That's not content. That's form, actually, the form of the media. It's not likely. What I would like to see is the reconvening of a new UN panel. I would love to be, would love to see the UN call for a panel like the McBride panel that sat in the 1970s and produced the McBride report. We are really ready for an updated version of the McBride report. It was released in 1980. That's almost 50 years ago, and I think maybe for the 50th anniversary of McBride, we should see a new report. And I hope that, the next Secretary General of the UN most likely will be from the South. I think it's Latin America's turn. Some people are throwing around the name Michelle Bachelet of Chile to be the next Secretary General of the UN. Whoever it will be from Latin America, I very much hope that they will help impanel a new commission to look at the information order. Because, in fact, we don't know exactly, how much monopolization has taken place. The undersea cable that connects Chile to the world, for instance, goes to Los Angeles, and it's owned by a private company. So, there's no real public infrastructure connecting this country to the world. I am coming to you from Santiago through this undersea cable to Los Angeles, and then down to Brazil through another cable, most likely, maybe also owned by a private company. I mean, all of this stuff will need to be analyzed by a UN commission. You and I can't do this. We don't have the resources. You need major resources to get the information, to have a good document on the communications order. And I very much hope that the next Secretary General, or maybe even the current Secretary General, before he leaves, will impanel a commission, give it like a 2-year mandate to come up with a serious report with action items to help democratize the information order, which is much more than just who controls the media outlet, which is also who owns the satellites, who owns undersea cables, who controls the speed of transmission. Like, if they don't like what we are saying right here, they can slow down the speed of upload through the cable lines. That's very easy to do if you own the cable. Well, we need to know all that. People don't know that. They think that, we are talking here and it's automatically going to the World Wide Web and it just automatic. No, this is it's all old fashioned infrastructure. It's cables, it's wires, it's switches, it's controls, and we don't have enough of that information available to the public.
Yeah, and these companies they defy governments. I mean, like here in Brazil, the ex was facing the Ministry of Justice here.
Yes, Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court.
And
So
Elon Musk just dismissed all of that and made fun of the Brazilian government. I mean, it's extraordinary. He's a private citizen, just mocking the whole Brazilian system.
okay, so let's go now to the United States presidential elections. What do you make of that?
I mean, what does one say when the US goes for presidential election? I say there's a difference between, on the one side, the situation for citizens within the US and for those who live outside. For those who live outside, by and large, it makes no difference who gets elected, by and large, because they will continue the state's project of using military power to assert the dominion of the US. I don't think it makes any difference for those outside. Those inside, there will be a whole series of arguments made about, say, abortion rights or made about gun control and various things. I'm sympathetic to the fact that people have those as important issues. But if you're worried about, let's say, the Palestinians who are being bombed right now or NATO's expansion eastward, you can rest assured that the policy will remain the same, regardless of whether Trump or Harris win. There'll be no difference at all. In fact, even on issues of gun control, very interesting, Kamala Harris was on Oprah Winfrey's show where she said, I'm a gun owner. And, same to indicate that she has no problem with gun ownership. So I don't even know whether these are big differences, even on these issues. The left, the center right and the right sort of come together during elections and often even in policy. Now, of course, there are elections with big implications around the world, but these are not happening in the United States. I mean, there are other elections with very important implications that will come up in time, and we'll have to follow them. I mean, I'm looking carefully at the elections in a small country, in Ireland, seeing if Sinn Féin is able to form a government in the Republic of Ireland, push for the unification of all of Ireland. That's interesting. Looking at the regional elections in Germany coming up, those will be another push for stopping the war in Ukraine. Very important election. These little elections in Europe can be quite consequential. I'm interested, obviously, because I'm here in Santiago in Chile. What's the next presidential election going to look like? Will it have a center-left candidate who can defeat the far right? Or will all of the southern cone, both Argentina and Chile, go to the far right? In Uruguay, there's another election, where Frente Amplio likely will win. I mean, all I'm trying to say is that we focus a lot on the US election because they tell us it's important. But actually, I don't think it's that meaningful in terms of the outcome. I think in terms of how the relationship between US and Brazil will go, I think it's going to be pretty identical. Only difference is, I think if Trump comes in and his friend Elon Musk will be sitting next to him, I think they're going to try to punish Brazil somehow for humiliating Musk. And that could be something different. Kamala Harris wouldn't do that.
And if Trump gets elected, it would also give more strength to Bolsonarism in Brazil, wouldn't it?
I think yes, but let's face some facts here. Is that these right-wing movements are gaining strength without the help from Washington. I mean, I agree with you. That the role of Steve Bannon earlier, now Vox and their Madrid forum, in which Bolsonaro plays a role, so does the Venezuelan far right, and so on. This international support does help them. But I would say that, the real problem isn't who's in Washington, but what's happening on the ground. You know, I don't have the experience you have, of course, at all of Brazil. I generally come to Rio, Sao Paulo, whatever it is. The few times I've left, and I of course went to Curitiba to see Lula. That was when he was in prison. But if you look outside these cities, I'm told it's a very different scenario. That there is a base for Bolsonaro that is very hard for the left to overcome. It's a base of the petty bourgeoisie, of landlords, and so on, of the big agricultural lobbies. They don't like any of the left initiatives. They don't want to see any of that. The one time I went into a rural part of Minas Gerais, I was pretty surprised. It looked a lot like Iowa. We were driving on a road and this pickup truck went by. There was a guy sitting in the front. He had a gun. He had a big, like a Jesus thing in the back. And I thought, well, I could just be in Iowa or in, one of the other American Midwest states. It's the difference is that the gentleman speaks Portuguese and not English. But he could have parachuted from there. He looked like an American farmer. So, the problem isn't what's happening elsewhere. The problem is also on the ground, how to attract that gentleman not to be, somebody who supports Bolsonaro. Is there a possibility of creating new class alliances in a place like Brazil to cut across the Bolsonaro support base, which is, a combination of the big bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, and so on? They have produced a coalition of classes that benefits them. Even in this last election, it wasn't like the right was vanquished in Brazil. And it's not like the left won either. Lula won the election, not the left. And that, I think, is interesting. Wouldn't it be just as an exercise? And I'm sorry to do this. It's a very wrong exercise. But every time I look at the Brazilian presidential election map, it really does look like two countries. There is this northern part, less populated, obviously, but fiercely for Lula, then some cities, and then this southern part that is super anti-Lula. Imagine there could be this sort of socialist republic of the north, the socialist republic of the Amazon. But obviously that's not how the world works. And how the world works is there is a strong class unity for a Bolsonaro bloc, which I don't think the left has been able to peel apart and break up. And that continues. And I don't know if the Trump election is going to solidify that or not. What it will do is it will give Mr. Bolsonaro increased international credibility because Trump will invite him to the White House and so on, maybe give him more visibility. That's very, very possible. As an insult to Lula, he might invite Bolsonaro to go golfing in Florida, and that kind of thing could happen, and that's disturbing. But I don't think it's necessarily going to change the dynamics of political support for the coalition that the Bolsonaristas already have.
Are you frustrated with Lula? What do you feel about the Lula's government? How he is coping with this presence of the far right?
One of the things that happens when this sort of far right of a special type arrives is that various forms of liberalism, the center left, ally with traditional right-wing forces or the conservative forces. This is happening in many parts of the world. The coalition brings together the conservatives, old traditionalists, with the center left, and I think that's what Lula has produced. If you can see that in his vice presidential pick, it brings the traditionalists into a coalition with the center left. Anybody the day after the election victory, which was a considerable victory for President Lula, he went from a jail in Curitiba to becoming the president of the republic again, that's a huge victory, and I salute him till now for that. But the creation of this coalition to defeat the right in the election already meant that its space of maneuver was limited. So I'm not disappointed with this government, frankly. I just think this is all you could expect of this government because of the coalition that they created, the lack of independent space of the left. Obviously, I wish that the left had a larger role in this government. I wish, for instance, that the landless workers movement somehow had a political presence. Now the landless workers movement, recognizing this, are kind of dipping their feet into elections, running candidates here and there. But, I think it's about time that the Brazilian left coordinated itself. Like, I hope very much, and I'm saying this without the up-to-date facts on the matter, but I hope very much in cases like the mayor's race in Porto Alegre, after the tragic and terrible and predictable floods in Porto Alegre, I hope in that mayor's race, you're going to see a kind of coalition of forces where the landless movement, the various communist groups, the center left, the PT, and the others gather a big historical bloc and crush the right, and then come back to building Porto Alegre as a city of the left, which it had been a long time ago. I mean, that kind of institutional example will do a lot in a country like Brazil to lift the spirits of other people. So I very much hope that your Porto Alegre mayor's election will become a standard for this. I don't have the latest facts, so I might be
We are from Porto Alegre.
We are from Porto Alegre, and it's a tragedy because the latest polls, they tell us that Melo, exactly the one who was responsible for helping nature to destroy Porto Alegre, is way ahead in the front. So what can you make of this? It's incredible. It's incredible.
I mean, I know the election is what, like in 2 weeks or something. I mean, I don't know. I don't know, again, as you say, he may be ahead and so on. I don't even know what the various forces of the left have done. I don't know, but I'm guessing that they didn't coalesce around a candidate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, this is precisely, this is how we shoot ourselves in the foot. I mean, it is an election. It's not the surrendering of our programs. You can keep your separate programs, but I think electorally, it's well worth having a historical bloc shaped in order to make a point. And I think if you can't make the point after the destructive floods, which were basically predictable and so on, if you can't do that, I don't know, there has to be a serious introspection.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they are in for that. Maybe not. I hope not, but well. Vijay, we'd like to thank you very much for your participation here in TUTAMÉIA. Agradecemos também a todo mundo que se reuniu para acompanhar aqui ao vivo essas reflexões, essas informações que nos traz o Vijay. Lembramos a todos que essa entrevista fica disponível em todos os canais TUTAMÉIA. É só buscar por TUTAMÉIA TV e você nos encontra nas várias plataformas de podcast, no Facebook, no YouTube. No YouTube, não deixe de se inscrever no nosso canal, clicar na sinetinha para receber avisos de novos vídeos. Visite também o nosso site, o TUTAMÉIA. O endereço é tutameia.jor.br. Você pode também participar do grupo Amigos do TUTAMÉIA no WhatsApp. O link para ingresso nesse grupo está disponível na descrição desse vídeo. E agora, então, antes das despedidas, vamos ouvir novamente a palavra do Vijay. So now, Vijay, before the goodbye, we'd like to, this time with no question, your message for the Brazilian people that are watching you and will be with us in the internet.
Well, all I want to say is that, sometime very soon, Expresso Popular is going to publish in Portuguese the latest book that Noam Chomsky and I have done It's about Cuba, and it's about our defense of the Cuban Revolution against the attempt by the United States to suffocate Cuba. I very much hope that when Espresso Popular puts this book out, I come back and I talk to the two of you about it, but also that this book comes from Noam and I as a way, as a hope that we need to restart the Cuba solidarity movement, including in Brazil. I think there needs to be a lot more understanding of the situation of Cuba now, and the need for good, decent people to defend it against suffocation. So, yeah, when the book comes out from Espresso Popular, I'll let you know.
Great.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Muito
Bye,
obrigado,
thanks.
pessoal.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.